in this morning's talk, upsetting. We'll publish a helpline information at the end of the service. Anyway, amongst the winces, I'm relieved to say that this short chapter is about much more than circumcision. That's included, and I'll mention that as we go through, but it's about much more than that. See, Joshua was an incredible person. We read of Joshua that he was filled with the spirit of wisdom. He was a man of courage. He had the courage to be sent into Canaan as a spy and to tell it the way it was and to recommend that they went in. He was a formidable military commander. Do you remember that time where he repelled the Amalekite attack? As Moses looked on with his hands raised, it was Joshua that was doing the fighting. Well, Moses had died within sight of the promised land, and Joshua had taken up the leadership of Israel. And Joshua's mission was very clear, if not extremely challenging. To invade, to conquer, to take possession of the promised land, a land pledged by God to Abraham and his descendants some 700 years earlier. What was needed was a special military operation. Not as a pretext for stealing what didn't belong to him, but as God's way of cleansing the land from all remnants of paganism, to create a nation faithful to the righteous rule of God. For a holy God was preparing his holy people to create a holy land. So this short chapter, I just want us to consider three aspects of the mission that Joshua was charged with leading. And the three things are these: a broken enemy, a restored identity, and then a higher authority. A broken enemy. When it comes to warfare, history teaches us that timing can be crucial. It was around 82 years ago when the British Expeditionary Force was sent to help defend France from the rapid advance of Hitler's panzer divisions across Europe. French defences were soon circumvented, and an ill-prepared British army found itself trapped on the French coast at the mercy of a better-armed, rampant German army. And then, inexplicably, the Germans decided to pause their advance, allowing the hastily conceived Operation Dynamo, as it was known, to rescue some 350,000 men from the beaches of Dunkirk with Navy vessels and a flotilla of boats. Many films, of course, depicting that rescue. And incidentally, fervent prayer played its part in that event in history. By contrast, more recently, just 4 months ago, in fact, a 40-mile-long column of armour initially swept towards Kyiv, but ill-prepared for the determined resistance it would face, was stopped in its tracks and forced to retreat in failure. There are countless other examples. Timing matters when it comes to military operations. Timing matters. See, Joshua faced a broken enemy. The Canaanites were shaking in their sandals. Miraculously, their natural river defense had completely dried up for just long enough for a whole nation to walk across on dry riverbed. Worse still, it was blindingly obvious that Israel's God had orchestrated the miracle. Priests and the Ark of the Covenant leading the river-stopping procession. A stone for each of the 12 tribes of Israel, taken from the riverbed and set up as a memorial, just to rub it in. We read there at the end of chapter 4, so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. The impact on the Canaanite kings was immediate. Verse 1, their hearts melted, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. a broken enemy. Joshua, what are you waiting for? Go for it. Seize the day. Take the opportunity. Don't hold back now. What better time could there be? But see, the Lord had other ideas. Demoralized the Canaanites may have been, but the Israelites were far from ready. In the 40 years wandering in the wilderness, they'd lost their identity. They had forgotten who they were. Point 2, a restored identity. That's what was needed, for Israel had a problem. Their desert wanderings had proved to be a spiritual wilderness as well as a geographical one. It had been 40 years since their flint knives had done their thing. 39 years since they'd last celebrated Passover as a nation. They'd moaned and groaned. They'd given Moses a hard time. They had disobeyed God. They'd stopped trusting him. They'd spurned his manna menu. And barely a circumcised fighting man was left apart from Joshua and Caleb. They were still a nation, but scarcely a holy one. They desperately needed to be reminded of who they were before they started fighting any battles. They may have felt invincible, but God was about to make the fighting men feel anything but. Passover, well, that wasn't so bad. A hasty meal to remind them of God's protection and mercy on them in freeing them from slavery in Egypt. But there was a snag. Circumcision was a prerequisite to celebrating Passover. Brave fighting men reduced to tears and incapacitated for a week or more, just long enough to give their quaking enemies time to bolster their defenses and shore up their resolve. These signs of the covenant evidently mattered to God. Circumcision, a sign of the promise God made to Abraham centuries earlier, a covenant he and his descendants were to keep, God's special people. Highly symbolic of being set apart for God, holy, consecrated, a covenant commitment to trust and serve the Lord as King. And you know, there's a far from subtle explanation, but its meaning goes along these lines. And let's flash that warning up again. This isn't for the faint-hearted. If I am not loyal in faith and obedience to the Lord, may the sword of the Lord cut off me and my offspring as I have cut off my, and I'll leave the rest to your imagination, consecration, placing themselves under God's rule, subject to his authority, a solemn sign. And Passover, spared by the Lord from terrible judgment, protected, released from slavery, a timely reminder of where the nation had been just 40 years earlier. The day after they did so, the day after Passover, 40 years' supply of manna finally dried up, and they got their first taste of milk and honey. It wasn't actually milk and honey, I don't know if you noticed in the reading, but they got their first taste of the bounty of Canaan, a land promised to God's holy people, his consecrated, set apart, redeemed people. His children of promise needed to be reminded of what those promises were. A holy God was calling his people to be holy so that they could make the promised land holy too. They needed their identity restored before the conquest even started. And thirdly, the most significant intervention of all. Enter the commander of the Lord's army, a higher authority. Just to remind ourselves of what we read earlier. Now, when Joshua was near Jericho, He looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. A higher authority. There's a scattering of physical appearances of God through the Old Testament. God in human form, theophany, Christophany. Joshua seems to ask a very reasonable question of this commander of the Lord's army. Whose side are you on? Whose side are you on? Ours or theirs? He didn't expect the reply that he got. Never mind whose side I'm on. Who's on the Lord's side? That's what matters. Who's on the Lord's side? Joshua, take off your sandals. The impending conquest of Canaan was less about military might and tactics, far more about who would choose to have God reign. A conscious, willing decision to dedicate soul and mind, heart and strength to serve and worship the living God. You see, the Canaanites were to face the judgment of God because they didn't revere him. Their pagan idolatry was what was being judged. Later on, the Israelites themselves would face it too, as they disobeyed God and turned from him. Godless regimes come and go. Ultimately, God is sovereign. He's king. All will one day bow the knee. So what can we learn from courageous Joshua? Formidable commander, filled with a spirit of wisdom as he was. Well, we can learn this. God is on a mission. And it's not a special military operation. He's out to clean things up. He's out to put things right. It's not about whose side the Lord is on. It's about who's on the Lord's side. And that's different. That's got a different focus. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's not against rulers, against the authorities. It's against the powers of this dark world and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Well, you might say, don't we know it? How readily we see the damage it causes, how helpless we often feel, how defeated, and how caught up, how compromised, how inadequate, how discouraged. Well, let's remember this morning that through the finished work of Christ on the cross and through the power of his resurrection, our enemy is broken. Our enemy is broken. We too can celebrate our release from slavery to sin and self and live in God's rest with our identity restored, children of promise, Jesus, our Passover lamb, a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that we may declare the praises of him who called us out of darkness into his wonderful light. And let's acknowledge today that as we too submit to a higher authority, that it's not whether he's on our side that counts, it's whether we're on his. For one day he will overcome all powers of evil in the world and bring God's people into their eternal rest. Do we want to live in a place where God reigns? Do we want to take possession of all that he's promised us? Do we want to overcome evil and help establish a kingdom where he reigns as king? You see, his reign begins here and here and here and here in our hearts. That's where the reign of God begins. His church only ever truly thrives when the people in it are characterized by the reign of God in their lives. Circumcised hearts, released, restored, consecrated, sanctified, set apart to God. By his grace, may God help us be that kind of people.